Hello and welcome back to Financial Podcast, the show that breaks down the big financial news of the week. I'm your host, Olivia, and today we have some truly significant developments to discuss that could reshape the global trade landscape and directly impact businesses and consumers alike. Late last week, a major legal blow landed against a core economic policy of the current administration. A federal court delivered a sweeping ruling concerning the tariffs imposed by President Donald Trump. This decision came from the U.S. Court of International Trade, a specialized federal court based in New York that handles civil lawsuits related to international trade law. The ruling specifically targeted the massive tariffs that President Donald Trump implemented shortly after beginning his second term in office. The court's decision was quite broad and stemmed from two consolidated cases, VOS Selections versus United States and Oregon versus Department of Homeland Security. A three-judge panel unanimously agreed that President Trump's tariffs, as they currently stand, are illegal. This panel was notably composed of judges appointed by Presidents Ronald Reagan, Barack Obama, and even President Trump, yet they reached a unified conclusion in an unsigned opinion. The primary legal basis President Trump had relied upon for imposing these sweeping tariffs was the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, often referred to as IEPPA. This statute permits the president to regulate transactions involving any property in which any foreign country or a national thereof has an interest. However, this power can only be exercised to deal with an unusual and extraordinary threat with respect to which a national emergency has been declared. The court's first significant conclusion was that while a federal appeals court had previously held that this power to regulate foreign transactions can sometimes include imposing tariffs, the IEPPA statute cannot be interpreted to grant President Trump unlimited tariff authority. The judges reasoned that IEPPA does not give the president the power he claimed to impose tariffs of any amount on any nation and for any duration. Crucially, the trade court concluded that if the statute were read to grant President Trump such unchecked authority over tariffs, it would violate the Constitution's separation of powers principle. The court highlighted that Congress cannot simply give away its full authority over tariffs to the president. The court pointed to a line of Supreme Court decisions which established that Congress may only delegate authority to the president if it lays down by legislative act an intelligible principle to which the person or body authorized to fix such tariff rates is directed to conform. Therefore, the court found that if the president's authority over tariffs were as broad as President Trump claimed, the IEPPA statute would be unconstitutional because it lacks sufficient instructions on when or how that authority could be used. This argument aligns with the view that the ruling blocks a massive power grab by the president, as one of the plaintiff's co-counsel described it, emphasizing that IEPPA does not grant such boundless authority and would be unconstitutional if it did. The court's second major holding addressed President Trump's claim that the tariffs were necessary to address the nation's deficit, which he had declared a national emergency. The court noted that there's a separate federal law, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, specifically designed to govern the president's power to impose tariffs in response to trade deficits. This statute, however, only permits the president to impose tariff rates of 15% or lower, and those tariffs can only remain in effect for a maximum of 150 days. The trade court concluded that President Trump could only rely on his authority under Section 122 if he intended to impose tariffs to respond to trade deficits. This means any tariffs imposed under this law would expire after about 5 months. The plaintiffs had argued that the long-standing nature of the U.S. trade deficit, spanning 49 consecutive years, meant it didn't qualify as an unusual and extraordinary threat, or set an emergency justifying the use of IEPPA. The court's third significant holding arose from the IEEPA language requiring that any tariffs imposed under the statute must actually, quote, deal with an unusual and extraordinary threat. President Trump had attempted to justify some of his tariffs by claiming they would help deter the importation of illegal drugs into the United States. However, the trade court found that these tariffs did not actually do anything direct to deal with the threat of drug trafficking and were thus illegal under IEEPA. The court explicitly argued that the tariffs do not directly prevent any illegal drugs from entering the United States. While President Trump's lawyers contended that the tariffs would help reduce illegal drug trafficking by pressuring other nations to crack down on drug dealers to avoid the tariffs, the court rejected this argument. The court stated that, however sound this might be as a diplomatic strategy, it does not comfortably meet the statutory definition of dealing with the cited emergency, adding that it is difficult to conceive of any IEEPA power that could not be justified on the same ground of applying pressure. The court also ruled that the tariffs imposed on China, Mexico, and Canada, previously justified under IEEPA due to claims about the flow of drugs and illegal immigrants, were blocked. The court found that these tariffs also did nothing to deal with the problems they were supposed to address. Finally, the court concluded its opinion by issuing a permanent nationwide injunction against the tariffs. The court made a strong argument that a nationwide order was constitutionally required because the Constitution states that all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. Therefore, if these tariffs could not be lawfully imposed on one person, the same rule must apply to all persons. This injunction not only ordered a permanent halt to most of President Trump's tariffs imposed under IEEPA, but also barred any future modifications to them using the same legal basis. What happens next is where things get interesting, and the future remains uncertain. This trade court decision is the first federal court ruling on the legality of these specific tariffs, but it is unlikely to be the last. Decisions from this court are typically appealed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit and then potentially to the Supreme Court. The Trump administration has wasted no time and has swiftly filed notice of appeal against the ruling. This swift appeal suggests the government is possibly working rapidly to prepare a motion for an emergency stay of the order, which would allow the tariffs to remain in place while the appeals process unfolds. The Supreme Court will almost certainly be called upon to provide a final answer on the legality of these tariffs. The trade court's order accompanying the decision stipulated that the necessary administrative orders to put the permanent injunction into effect shall issue within 10 calendar days. This means that if no higher court steps in to grant a stay or overturn the ruling within this timeframe, President Trump's tariffs imposed under IEPA could cease to exist very soon. The speed of the administration's appeal highlights the urgency with which they are addressing this deadline. This ruling amounts to a categorical rejection of the legal foundation President Trump used for some of his signature and most controversial actions early in his second term. It's a significant blow. However, it's important to note what the ruling did not block. Tariffs that President Trump imposed using his authority under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, such as the 25% tax on most imported autos and parts, as well as on all foreign-made steel and aluminum, are left in place. These Section 232 tariffs depend on a Commerce Department investigation revealing national security risks from imported products, a different legal pathway than the emergency powers law challenged in this case. The White House has strongly criticized the court's authority in this matter. White House spokesperson Kush Desai stated that it is not for unelected judges to decide how to properly address a national emergency. He added that the administration remains, quote, committed to using every lever of executive power to address this crisis and restore American greatness. White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy Stephen Miller reacted on social media, claiming the judicial coup is out of control. Despite the setback, analysts at Goldman Sachs noted that the White House likely has other tools available that could make this only a temporary problem. They believe President Trump is expected to find a workaround after this major blow. According to Goldman, the ruling blocks the 10% baseline tariff on most imports and the additional tariffs on China, Canada, and Mexico that were imposed using the emergency powers. Goldman Sachs analysts pointed to several other legal means the Trump administration could potentially use to impose tariffs. One option is Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, which does not require a formal investigation and could be a relatively swift way to impose tariffs. Under the statute, the administration could impose tariffs of up to 15% to address trade deficits. However, as the trade court also noted, tariffs under Section 122 are limited to 150 days unless Congress takes further action. Other potential avenues mentioned include swiftly launching Section 301 investigations on key trading partners, which could lay the groundwork for tariffs, although Goldman Sachs estimated this process would likely take several weeks at a minimum. Section 232 tariffs, already in place for certain sectors, could potentially be broadened to other industries. Another statute, Section 338 of the Trade Act of 1930, allows the president to impose levies of up to 50% on imports from countries that discriminate against the U.S., although Goldman Sachs noted this has not been used before. The ruling has certainly thrown President Trump's trade policy into turmoil. For now, he might not have the threat of these specific import taxes as a negotiating tool as he had intended, since using them would require congressional approval, at least temporarily. Wendy Cutler, a former U.S. trade official, suggested that trading partners currently negotiating during the 90-day tariff pause period might be hesitant to make further concessions until there is greater legal clarity. Companies may also need to reassess their supply chains, perhaps speeding up shipments to the U.S. due to the uncertainty. The market reaction following the ruling was generally positive. Equity markets around the world saw gains, with Asia-Pacific markets rising and U.S. futures jumping. European markets also saw some gains. The U.S. dollar also rose slightly against major rivals, which analysts attributed partly to investors seeing the legal setback to the sweeping tariffs as a respite from unpredictable trade policies. This indicates that some in the market welcome the potential reduction in trade uncertainty, even if temporary. However, some analysts noted that the market reaction was somewhat muted because President Trump still has various other options to raise tariffs. As one analyst put it, things are more complicated, but the end goal for President Trump remains the same, and in politics, where there is a will, there is a way. From a legal perspective, James Ransdell, a partner at law firm Cassidy Levy Kent, described the trade court opinion as the first substantive ruling out of federal court to truly address the core arguments of the plaintiff's challenge. He emphasized that the speed of the administration's appeal was very unusual. Ransdell also stated that it was certainly a possibility that the Supreme Court would ultimately decide the case, especially given the limited precedent on this particular statute and similar presidential actions. Stephen Blitz, chief U.S. economist at T.S. Lombard, commented that President Trump has a very good understanding of how to use the courts to play for time. He predicted that the first step would likely be an emergency appeal to the Supreme Court, seeking a ruling to keep the tariffs in place while the appeals process unfolds. Blitz highlighted that this kind of sweeping executive order was always likely to face challenges in the courts, underscoring the difference between a monarchy and a constitutional democracy with a legal system. The ruling is seen as a significant setback for President Trump's efforts to use trade taxes to bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. and reduce the trade deficit, which were key campaign promises. Without the broad authority claimed under IEEPA, the administration may need to rely on slower processes like lengthier trade investigations and different trade laws to back their tariff threats. Attorneys representing the plaintiffs hailed the ruling. Jeffrey Schwab, senior counsel at the Liberty Justice Center, stated that the decision reaffirms that the president must act within the bounds of the law and protects American businesses and consumers from destabilizing effects of volatile, unilaterally imposed tariffs. Ilya Somin, co-counsel, called it a ruling against a massive power grab by the president, asserting that IEEPA does not grant such authority and would be unconstitutional if it did. It's worth noting the perspective of a former senior economic advisor to President Trump, Stephen Moore, who, despite being a big Trump supporter, warned that no president should have the unilateral authority to set tariff rates without congressional approval. He stated that Congress is the body responsible for making laws and changing tax policies, and that it is dangerous for the country for any president to assert the authority to impose taxes on American citizens. Businesses are currently scrambling to understand the full implications of this ruling. While the ruling immediately invalidates the blanket 10% tariffs and other tariffs imposed under IEEPA, the appeals process means the situation could change.
For example, Jaguar Land Rover noted that as things stand, they are still paying significant tariffs on vehicles shipped to the US, and the recent agreement to reduce tariffs on cars and steel has yet to come into effect. The UK government has stated that the decision is a domestic matter for the US, but noted that this is only the first stage of legal proceedings. They highlighted their recent agreement with the US to cut tariffs on some cars and steel and are working to ensure businesses benefit from that deal as quickly as possible. In summary, a significant federal court ruling has challenged the legal foundation of a major part of President Trump's trade policy, specifically the sweeping tariffs imposed under emergency powers. The court found President Trump exceeded his authority and that the statute he used, i.e. EPA, doesn't support such broad tariff powers and would be unconstitutional if it did. The ruling issued a nationwide injunction against these tariffs. However, the Trump administration has swiftly appealed the decision, and the case is expected to make its way to the Supreme Court. While other tariffs remain in place and the administration has potential alternate legal avenues, the uncertainty surrounding the outcome of the appeals process means the situation for businesses and global trade remains fluid. The next few weeks could be critical as higher courts weigh in. That wraps up our look at this major trade development. Thank you for joining me on Financial Podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our future episodes as we continue to track these stories and their financial implications. Until next time, I'm Olivia, signing off.